This is That Exciting Dude, and you know the drill. That's right, this is That Exciting Dude, otherwise known as Ted. You are listening to Stories, Lies, and Shenanigans. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All I can say is, thanks for tuning in again. And we have it's an interesting podcast. I felt like I did a lot more journalism, a lot more of an investigator. Nah, that's not what it is called. It feels like that. I've got this little tickle cough going on, so there might be a few little juicy moments where there's some coughing that I'll try to hold back on. But while I'm thinking about it, let me get a Halls in the mouth. So we'll see how awesome this podcast can be with a piece of candy in my mouth. Well, it's not really candy, but you get what I'm trying to get at. Hard candy in my mouth. Alright, so you know the drill. We gotta start with the intro. As I've already mentioned, this is Stories, Lies, and Shenanigans. This is That Exciting Dude or Ted. You know, hit the follow button. Share this podcast. You know, whatever it is that you want. You know, you want to hear more of this voice? I'm on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Deezer, Castbox, and Podchaser, along with Apple. You finally got on iTunes. And then lastly, we need to give thanks to the artist Brock Hewitt, with Stories in Sound, and his sound bite is called Ages Ago. Artist Heartsman, and his sound bite is called Paradise Island. And Tropicana, and his sound bite is called Sound Roll. These are all from upbeat.com. UPPBEAT.com. Alright. Whew. Getting the rollings going. Alright. I normally don't really explain this, but you know, my choice of drink is typically always the good old agua, H2O. If you're not following, that's water. So when I need to take a drink, I will say something like this: drink. And I'll be taking a drink. Like I said, we have a very interesting podcast. But as I'm getting over to the correct note part, as always, we need to get the sprinkle of sports in. Let me get the mic a little closer. I did not set up very well. Hopefully there won't be too much noise into the mic as I move it. But yeah, as always, we're gonna start out with a sprinkle of sports, and then we'll get into the meat of the podcast, as I'd like to say. All right, here we go. You know the drill. If you're not into sports, go ahead about another, 3, 5, 6, whatever minutes, few minutes. It's actually going to be a pretty quick sports compared to my other ones, I think. I don't know. I always say that, and I think I spend a lot longer than what I do. All right, here we go with the sports. In NFL, the Lions barely squeezed another win past the New Orleans Saints with a score of 33-28. And then the Arizona Cardinals beat the Pittsburgh Steelers 24-10. That's a very surprising one. But I will say that Kyler Murray is back at quarterback. Then in the Bengals, Cincinnati Bengals beat the Jacksonville Jaguars, 34-31. That was actually a very good game for a little bit that I did watch. All right, in NBA, yep, my Pistons still, they El Succa. Would they have a record of 2 wins and 18 losses? Really, I don't follow NBA. I just like to throw that in every now and then. And then over to the National Hockey League, my beloved Red Wings. They have acquired Patrick Kane from the Rangers, but he used to be a long-time Chicago Blackhawk person. But, a lot of people are kind of wondering about this pickup that they made, but I think he's going to be still a great asset to the team, despite of a lot of injuries that he has had in the past 2 years, since he is starting to get up there in age. But the Red Wings, in the past week games, 3 or 4 games, they've had a few W's, aka wins, and just 1 loss, so that's good for them. In college football, we had the Michigan Wolverines beat the Iowa Hawkeyes in the Big Ten Conference Championship game. Next week is I believe it's the Army-Navy game. Then after that, it's a little break in the college until all the bowl games get set in place. Let me make sure on that one. I believe it's the Army and Navy game. It'll take just 1 second here as we are getting in here. Yeah, Army-Navy game will be this Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Alright. So there we have it for sports. So, I feel like this background music is a little high. No, it's about the normal. I think it's just because it's this background. Anyhow. Alright, it's time to the meat of the podcast here. So, this podcast. So what we're going to talk about is, this is probably, so far in all of my podcasting, talkings, expressings, this is probably going to be, so far, that's the key word, so far, as politically as I'm going to get. Now, this isn't politics, but it can fall in that range of politics. And basically what it is I'm going to be talking about the interrogation of Saddam Hussein. And basically what has inspired me about this is back in 2009, 8, I can't remember exactly when. That's pretty much where I've narrowed it down after watching all these interviews. Is I watched a documentary from this FBI agent that interrogated Saddam Hussein right after he was captured. And it really intrigued me. I mean, it intrigued me so much that I watched it like 2 or 3 times. And I don't know, I think it was just the answers that he received from Saddam, and just like how he worked, I guess you could say worked Saddam in the interrogation process. I don't know what about it, but it was intriguing. It was interesting. So yeah. So to start, I figured we got to start with a little bit. We got to start with some basics here. So So we're going to start out with Saddam Hussein. Obviously, he was the leader of Iraq. Unfortunately, didn't say look up from when to when. Obviously, from X until 2003. But that's like besides the point. Like I said, I'm more interested in just this interrogation and how we as in the United States kind of banana peeled all this information from him after he was captured. But a few things that are outside of the interrogation. Saddam Hussein, he was born April 28th, 1937. Alright, so as I'm going through this, I put most of these notes, they're in order. But of course, I was taking notes as I was watching all these new interviews because that documentary, believe it or not, I cannot find it anywhere. I have searched Amazon. I have searched just Google itself. And I cannot find this documentary for the life of me. It was a 60-minute, I've narrowed it down to, it was a 60-minute special about this FBI agent that interrogated Saddam. And so the person that interrogated Saddam, his name is George Pirro. He was born in Lebanon. He's a Lebanese American. He led this team in 2003 to interrogate Saddam. His family immigrated to the U.S. when he was 12 years old. And he thinks that the reason why the FBI chose, his name is George Pirro, the reason why the FBI chose George was because of his background, because he spoke English and Arabic, and hopefully I'm saying this one correct, Aramaic and French very fluently, which is all good attributes to have, interrogating somebody from the Middle East. So, of the few things that I could still find of this interview, there's a couple just like little tidbits on YouTube or in other video platforms that I could find. So I could find some tidbits, and a lot of this is coming from memory, and then a few is coming from the few videos that I could find. A couple new interviews that I did find where he, was talking about this process that he took. So yeah, I mean, we're talking about, like I said, Saddam and this interrogation process. So what was interesting, and I'm going to say this a lot, like, this is interesting, I found it fascinating, and so I think this first really kind of good, I mean, I guess it really does make sense. And I guess before George Pirro started his interrogation, he said that he spent just a solid 2 weeks of not worrying about his mission, but he spent 2 weeks just gaining a good rapport of Saddam, with Saddam, learning about his moods, his thought process, and just, how Saddam acted in general, but nonetheless just kind of get close to him, get, comfortable with him, and so forth. But, so yeah. Let's see. So what was interesting is all of his tactics George Piro, all of his tactics that he used, nothing illegal, to get information was, was just very basic, maneuvers. And I'll go over a couple of them later. Again, my notes are a little out of place. I could have been a little better, but I'll mention some a little later. So going back to what was the mission. The mission again was the main focus for the re-entry into Iraq Second War, which started in early 2003, and that had to do with weapons of mass destruction and getting ISIS. And as we know now, we were all duped by our American leaders that drove this weapons of mass destruction, and they were all part of 9/11, which we would find out in this interrogation that Saddam had nothing to do with it, or no weapons of mass destruction. But and here we go again. So, and here's another interesting part: is during this whole interrogation, Saddam admitted that he actually feared Iran more than the U.S. I mean, I thought that was interesting. I mean, it kind of makes sense. I mean, they're neighbors. They had nuclear power. You got, Iraq sitting there. I guess you could say he was duping the whole world, thinking he still had, weapons of mass destruction when, his weapons program and systems or his military was really nothing. But he definitely put on a good show. Saddam believed that he could have actually have stopped the war, but he said that he totally miscalculated President Bush and how strong his intentions were on the invasion. He said until it was too late, until they were literally in his backyard, and he was seeing his soldiers giving up and not fighting any U.S. forces as they crossed from Kuwait into Iraq when, the whole war started back in 2003. When the whole liberation, invasion, takeover Iraq, whatever you want to label it. I mean, it was an invasion of Iraq. We're just going to put it out there. So basically, in this whole interrogation between getting caught and finally his execution, for Saddam, it was a year and 6 months later, roughly, give or take, after being caught, interrogated. Then he was sent to trials in the Iraq system for his war crimes and the way he died was by public hanging, and that was on December 30th, 2006, and that was at Camp Justice, to be exact, which was an undisclosed location at the time. I'm sure it possibly could still be. All right. Oh, an interesting point to his hanging is Saddam, when he was being hung, before he got hung, his wish was that a hood would not be used as they did their process of hanging him. And the reason why is because he was so humiliated when he got caught and how he looked, that he said that he didn't show fear but B, he wanted the world to see him for who he really was and that he wasn't scared at all to die. Which, I thought that was interesting. I mean, maybe it's not, but I think it is. He was asked the question if he had any remorse or regrets and of his choices while he was alive. And and he said no. He said he'd do it all over again. So back to at the start of the interrogation. So, in order for George Pirro to, so the big thing that Saddam always liked was control. I mean, he was a leader. He liked control. That was his big thing. So the first thing that George Pirro did to show Saddam that he was in charge, and I thought this was very fascinating, and this is probably basic. Maybe it could not be basic. I don't know. This could be basic interrogation skills. So basically what he did was, so all of the guards and everybody that Saddam came in contact with outside of George Pirro had 0 watches. So what he did is, George Pirro basically forced Saddam into a passively submitting. I mean, as usual, when someone's first caught, they're initially defiant. They're not asking for anything. They're not submissive at all. So how to get them submissive is George wanted to control time. And so the first thing that George did to prove to Saddam that he was in charge is he had Saddam in the interrogation room. He had his back to the window, and then George's back was to the door that entered. I mean, like typical. He didn't deny him the time if he asked, but he liked it when Saddam had asked for the time, because he would ask him like, "Oh, so you want to know what time it is?" And it was psychologically forcing Saddam into asking 4 things, and he could only ask George 4 things in the process that George Pirro was interrogating him. I thought that was interesting. I kind of touched on it earlier. Saddam wasn't, afraid of dying. He knew once he was caught, when he went into hiding, that he was going to, he was going to die. He didn't know how, but he knew that he was going to die. And he wasn't afraid to die. He wasn't afraid to die because he was 67 years old. He lived longer than the average Arab male have lived in his country. And he knew that, he was the leader of the cradle of civilization. His actions, they greatly impacted the Middle East and the world during his presence and power. So now we're going to go back to kind of the whole WMD part of it. So when he was interrogated, like I said, weapons of mass destruction kind of was a focal point. And when interrogated, what Saddam told George Pirro was, he's like, I had to, tell everyone, I had to make everyone think that I had these bombs because he knew if the world knew that he was vulnerable, he knew Iran would have, taken over Iraq. So he had to keep selling to the world that he had, all these weapons of mass destruction, these weapons, because he knew that things would have changed from Iran, trying to take over Iraq, and, become, I guess you could say, a new power, or, the Middle East. So yeah, I guess it makes sense. It makes sense. If you got someone that is going to overthrow you, yeah, you gotta dupe everybody. You just gotta do that. So that's pretty much what I can either find or remember from the FBI with George Pirro on the interrogation on Saddam. But in the process of trying to find all these videos, these older videos from that documentary, or the documentary itself that I originally saw, I also found this other individual that he was from the CIA that also interrogated Saddam. And this is where I could probably make a part 2 to this. I don't know if I will, because I could probably take all the information and really stack it next to each other from George and this individual that I'll get into in a bit from the CIA, because there's a few conflicting points of what they found of what the CIA gathered versus what the FBI gathered. So in watching this new person from the CIA interrogating Saddam, his name is John Nixon. I really didn't dig too much into his past. Basically, he was a senior leadership analyst with the CIA from 1998 until 2011. And he was part of the CIA team who interrogated Saddam. So it makes me wonder kind of how the FBI, were they on the same team? Were they on the, or was it separated where George would interrogate Saddam in blocks of time and then the CIA would have their time with him? I couldn't, they clearly didn't talk about each other. Actually, side note, there's one part that John Nixon does talk and references George Pirro and the FBI, and we'll get to that later, because I don't want to skip ahead. But it was interesting of what the CIA gathered and what the FBI gathered. Some of them definitely are the same things, and there was a lot of different things, and it was interesting. And I'm going to be using, like I said, I'm going to be using this word a lot between interesting and fascinating about how this whole process went with interrogating Saddam. And the CIA side of this is all super new to me, so I definitely had to really watch and definitely take notes and so forth for John Nixon and the CIA and his part. So John Nixon claims that he was the first person to interrogate Saddam. So I am going to kind of go back and forth. George Pirro never comes out and says, I was the first person or whatever. So, I don't know if it's an ego thing that this John Nixon has, but he claims that he was the first person to interrogate Saddam. I mean, clearly they both had the same timeline of when they were interrogating Saddam, so they both were clearly there at the, top secret location site of Camp Justice in Iraq, interrogating Saddam. Let's see. John Nixon said that Saddam's demeanor was very confrontational when he was first getting interrogated, which, I am going to keep bouncing back and forth. So, George Pirro kind of said, he said the same thing. It took a second. He was defiant. Let's see. John Nixon said that Saddam tried to demand the names of everybody that was around him in this interrogation room, and he tried to act like this, like a general leader. He tried to, say like, who are you, what's your rank, and who are you, and John had, John with the CIA had to quickly, he was like, no. We're not here to answer your questions. You're here to answer our questions. This is how this is going to work. He said, John said, once he really got talking with Saddam, Saddam, he warmed up and he was starting to talk, which, like George Pirro said, he spent 2 weeks just kind of building up a friendship with Saddam, getting to know him. When John said, there was obviously still being in Iraq and doing this investigation in a hot zone, in a red zone, there were still mortars, hitting the base, and they were getting really close to the location of where they were interrogating Saddam, and why everyone else was kind of, I don't want to say ducking, but kind of like oof, that was close. He said Saddam he never moved, never flinched, never batted an eye when the mortars went off. He showed no fear. And I think that goes back to the whole, he wasn't afraid to die part. John Nixon, it was kind of funny, he did say that the CIA was going to use enhanced interrogation but still approved methods, but was stopped by Washington. Now I'm going to use this term Washington a lot. It took a second to realize what he was saying. At first I was thinking the Pentagon, Washington, but no, he's talking about the White House, the politics, the politicians back in Washington, probably the president. Or maybe some up there. So whenever I say Washington or back in Washington, or it's referring to probably the White House. Let's see. So John said, so it's kind of funny. After he did this report with Saddam, and even after, Saddam opening up and answering questions, he told answers. John said Saddam told answers in such a secretive voice that when John Nixon from the CIA would leave the room, he almost had to really think about it. Did Saddam tell the truth? Or was he just telling me something? And he said a lot of times he would have to go and fact check these answers that Saddam was giving him. And then they would turn out to be true, and he just learned over time that this is just how Saddam talked, how he wanted to talk, how he wanted to answer things. He kind of had this, he said he had this secretive voice. But he said 99% of the time Saddam was, always telling the truth. He said there was only a very rare couple questions where he didn't, but for the most part, Saddam just, he turtled up and he was spilling. Not so much spilling right away. I mean, sometimes it took a couple times of asking. But he eventually would just, tell. Here's a very interesting fact. Here we go back to me saying interesting. Saddam actually thought after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers that Iraq and the U.S. would be natural allies in the fight against the extremism. And to go along with this, John asked Saddam about his thoughts on 9/11. And along with saying how he thought that he would be allies with the U.S., he was relieved because the enemy, he said his same enemy was now the same enemy that knocked down the towers, so which became the same enemy that the U.S., had to work against, which obviously was not the case at all. See, Saddam also said that he knew if Iraq was taken over by the U.S. would not be able to govern Iraq, and it would become a playground for terrorism. And, ironically, as we know now, later, that was exactly what happened. We couldn't take care of Iraq. It became this bed for ISIS and all of the terrorism groups. And it was, he was correct. And it goes to something, and basically, it goes back to how Saddam had to rule his own country. And I'm trying to find the tidbit on it. I totally can't even find it. Maybe I didn't write it down. There was a thing in the John Nixon interview that I saw when he was talking about interrogating, where Saddam talked about that how Saddam had to use techniques that no one approved of, but it was how he kept his country in check and how he kept all his people governed to keep the terrorism out of Iraq. Now, I'm not saying that Saddam was this awesome guy and individual. No, not by any means. All right. Drink. As I'm not even ready to drink. All right, drink. So here's another interesting. Here I go again. Interesting part again. So 5 years later, after this was all done, John Nixon didn't specify when. He just said 5 years later after this was all done. So if this was done like 03, 04, we'll just say 08-ish. He was called to the White House to finally get a debrief to the president. And the reason why this debriefing didn't happen earlier is because, really, as he was finding out information, it was getting fed back to Washington. And so, it's not like they didn't know what he was finding out. And when they finally were getting their answers of, Saddam not being any part of ISIS, and then obviously the big one, the weapons of mass destruction, Washington didn't like that at all, and they denied it. They just shoved it off to the side. They said that, he was lying, Saddam was lying, and they didn't want to believe it. So that's why John said he believes that's why he didn't get a debrief until the next administration was in office. So here's the one part that I was saying that John Nixon does bring up George Piro. So he was asked about that documentary, the one that I can't find. So what John Nixon said was, he's like, yeah, the FBI interrogator, George Piro, so he told Washington things that John Nixon didn't say. So when he was in this debrief, he was asked, like, well, the FBI found this, but you didn't find this. And I guess there was a conflict going on between the FBI and the CIA on, why didn't you tell us this versus why didn't you tell us this? And it just came down to that Saddam didn't tell the same interrogators always the same question, or, answer to the same questions. But it also depends on were they asking the same questions as well to not get the correct answer back, if that makes any sense. I don't know. I thought it was interesting. And that was pretty much all I could really find on this John guy. I only did watch like 2 videos. I think there was like one more that I probably could have watched. But with the information that I got out of the 2 videos that I watched for this John Nixon, I was like, this is definitely enough information. A lot of it's somewhat the same. And there was a good portion where it got into the politics, talking about President George Bush and, a lot of other things that, like I said, irrelevant to the nature of the podcast, which is, the interrogation of Saddam, which, like I said, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was fascinating. And just the things that went on with it as we were interrogating Saddam. And as we all know now, I mean, it was a big kosh-posh, and it shouldn't have happened. We shouldn't have been there. Clear and simple as that. I'm just going to leave it right there. I mean, I could really go into it. But I'm not going to. I'm just going to leave it as simple as the whole Iraq part shouldn't have happened. And in the process, many Iraqis, many American soldiers, along with just the allies within, a lot of people died. Alright, I'm going to put out, a lot of people died because of President Bush's agenda. It's plain and simple as that. And, you know what? I'm going to go into it. So, I didn't write any notes on this, so I'm definitely kind of freelancing it at this point. So, John Nixon, he did talk about, the whole reason why, and this is what the CIA kind of came up with. I mean, the whole point was he did want to finish his father's war from 91. President Bush claimed that he had information that Saddam wanted to assassinate his father, even though there was an attempt in 93 that was unsuccessful. It didn't help that President Bush, had Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, and Dick Cheney, and they were very war-hungry individuals. They were always like, let's go to war. We're going to do this by war. We're going to do this way. So it didn't help that a lot of, individuals around President Bush, was on the page of, let's get to war. Let's do this by war. yeah, I mean, it's just, like I said, we shouldn't have been there. There was a lot of misguided reasons. And hopefully, keyword is hopefully we can learn from this as we move forward in life. Will we? Probably not. Probably not at all. Because we like to preach that we learn from our mistakes, but there's so many times that we just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And it's unfortunate because a lot of people get caught in the crossfire. But that's a huge debate for a different time. So I'm just going to leave that right there. I'm going to put a big dot on that one. A big old boop dot. We're done right there. So yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I really found this documentary interesting. There was more to the documentary, but like I said, I totally can't remember everything from that documentary because it was so long ago that I did see it, and it's a shame that I can't find it anywhere. I mean, like I said, I have searched. It was done by 60 Minutes, and it was done, I think, in 2008 or 9 is what I've narrowed it down to. I always put it between like 08 and 2011. But after listening to when John was asked the question about the person that was the interviewer, said in 2008. So that's why it's actually 2008 now that I'm like talking myself into that it's not between X times. So it's 2008 that this documentary came out by 60 Minutes, but I've searched every nook and cranny of the web and I couldn't find it. Searched it in several different fashions and couldn't find it. Like I said, you can find little clips of it, but you can't find the whole thing, which is a bummer because I would really like to watch it again because, again, it was very fascinating. It was very interesting. And just how everything went down. And like I said, after finding this John Nixon character from the CIA and his side of everything, it shows how the intelligence community in the U.S. works, and there's always been a disconnect, and there will always be a disconnect because they're never on the same page. They have their different ways of how they do things, and it's just how it's been set up. It's how the two organizations, the FBI and the CIA, have been set up. So I don't know, it's interesting to me, maybe not to you. Hopefully you like the podcast. This is That Exciting Dude. You're listening to Stories, Lies, and Shenanigans. But before I go, I do have to mention you can catch it. I can't speak. You can catch me on YouTube at thatexcitingdude.com or thatexcitingdude at YouTube. I am on TikTok right now. I'm kind of in a lull of not doing any TikToks, but I am on TikTok at, you guessed it, That Exciting Dude. Or you can catch me on Twitch, where I stream. I stream about almost every day. If I'm playing a PC game, I'm trying to stream, especially if it's longer than like a half hour, 45 minutes. If it's like less than, then sometimes I don't. But yeah, you can catch me on Twitch at That Exciting Dude. I don't know, is there anything else? Is there anything else, people? Is there anything else you want to know? I'll tell you what you do. If you do want to know anything more, you can go to YouTube and you can go to this podcast because they get uploaded automatically because I have it set up that way to my YouTube. And if you want to comment or you want to ask me something, you can use the podcast to reference and you can put a comment. You can share it. Do all that good stuff. But, yeah, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. It's a little more lengthy than what my typical podcasts are. So that's a hooray, especially if you're still listening. But you know the drill. This is That Exciting Dude. You just got done listening to Stories, Lies, and Shenanigans. Let's do it.